A good night of Shabbos, friends. We're going to share Advar Torah, and this will be followed by the performance of a Niggun by my brother Sholom. And this will be dedicated to Nishmas, my father, Chaim Meir, ben Alta Yisochor Haleivi. One of the things you learn in today's Parsha, chapter 7, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu that I'm going to make great miracles and wonders in the land of Egypt. And ultimately, I'm going to liberate you from Egypt. And V'yodu Mitzrayim Kani Hashem, the Egyptians are going to know that I am God when they see the great acts of my hand. The Rabbi Moshe records that his grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, once asked, how is it, how do we explain this, that God says, I have to make all these miracles and wonders so that the Egyptians should know that I'm God? There are tremendous miracles, great wonders, all sorts of fantastic things going on here in the book of Shmos and in the story of the Exodus. And there's a lot more here than just teaching the Egyptians that I am God. It seems that there are much greater things going on. Baal Shem Tov didn't answer this question, but his grandson, the Degel Machan Ephraim, suggests an answer. But before we come to his answer, I want to point to a pasuk which he uses to base his answer. Beginning of the Parsha, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, "V'gam ani shemati esnakas b'nei Yisrael Hashem etzlaim avidim b'yisrael v'eskaras brisi." I've also heard the cries and the groans of Bnei Yisrael, whom the Egyptians enslave, and I remembered my covenant. And a similar formulation exists in Parshas Shmos, in chapter 2, where it says that the Jews cried out to God, and God heard their cries. And both in Parshas Va'eira as well as here, the Chaim HaKadosh notes that these are not ordinary cries, but here it says, "Esnakas b'nei Yisrael Hashem Mitzrayim avidim oisem," the cries of the Bnei Yisrael, whom the Egyptians enslaved, the cries are the result from their slave labor. And in Parshas Shmos it also says, "Vatal shavasam elokim min ha'avoda," the cries went up to God. These are cries that came from slave labor, from hard work. It says the Chaim, the cries that come from pain, from hard work, from suffering, God always hears those cries. And this is also mentioned in Tehillim, "Min ha'meitzar karas yikar," cry to God, "Min ha'meitzar," from distress, from suffering, and God certainly hears those cries. There's nothing that can interfere between the cries of pain and God listening to those cries. And with that in mind, I will come to the comments of the Degel Machan Ephraim. He says, look at this pasuk here. We can read it, the pasuk in Parshas Va'eira, right at the beginning, pasuk A. "V'gam ani shemati esnakas b'nei Yisrael Hashem etzlaim avidim oisem." God says, I have heard the cries of Bnei Yisrael, whom the Egyptians enslave. You can read this, that it's about the cries of Egyptian enslavement. But Egyptian enslavement has another dimension. Mitzrayim is not just Egyptian enslavement, but the word Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzah, which means a boundary, a constraint, narrow straits. Indeed, it's the same word that the Or Chaim cited in the pasuk, "Min ha'meitzar karasika," I cry to God from distress and from narrow straits. Because the circumstances are such that they're, even after Yetzias Mitzrayim, we're not out of Golus yet. And the Torah commands us to remember and to experience the Exodus every day of our life. And we have boundaries. We have physical boundaries, material boundaries, financial boundaries. Life has its limitations. There are also spiritual boundaries. And often the boundaries to spiritual progress, the Torah study, performance of mitzvahs, usually the result of physical boundaries and constraints. And so let's read the verse, says the Degel Machan Ephraim. Let's read it this way. "V'gam ani shemati esnakas b'nei Yisrael." Hashem says, I hear the cries of Bnei Yisrael. Hashem Mitzrayim avidim oisem. Their own personal Mitzrayim is enslaving them. It's not just the Egyptians of old, but their personal constraints can pull a person down and take him away from Torah and mitzvahs and Yiddishkeit in the optimal manner. And even somebody who's down and out and feels far from God and the deepest constraint has the ability to cry to God, because a Jew naturally and instinctively is aware of that eternal bond that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they can access that at any moment. And when you cry to God from that point, God looks down and hears those prayers and responds. Because prayers that come from distress and from suffering. And what's the word for distress and suffering? Meitzar. Mina meitzar karosika. Prayers that come from Mitzrayim. From spiritual distress. Not just from physical and material distress. Those cries, God hears those cries. And God says, I remember my covenant. What's the word of the covenant? A covenant is something that's eternal. That transcends all sorts of challenges and all sorts of difficulties. So that even if there should be a reason why the relationship should somehow wane, the covenant maintains that relationship. And God says, the Yid cries out to me. That's a sign that the Yid, the Jew, acknowledges his or her connection, that covenant with God. And God responds in kind, meter connected, meter measure for measure, remembers this covenant, and responds to take one out of his personal Mitzrayim. And so, says the Dagomach and Ephraim, the lesson from this pasuk here is that when God says, I made my great wonders so that the Egyptians should know that I am God, it wasn't about the Egyptians. But rather, God makes miracles and wonders and teaches us these stories in the Torah for us to contemplate them and remember them. V'yod Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem, so that we, in our own Mitzrayim, in our own place of constraints, can remember God and will remember to cry to God and to express that pain. And God will certainly affirm that, accept that, and reestablish His bond and relationship with us and send us Mashiach Tzidkenu and take us out of Golus. And we'll celebrate Shabbos Yerushalayim in our Kodesh. Thank you very much. Good Shabbos.